I'm James Miranda.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 6, Southern Front, December 24th, 2020, Port of Manzanillo, Mexico. Slowing his walk to stop under a nearby tree, General Han Lei looked at the three Mexican officials giving them the tour of the port. The weather was stunningly beautiful this time of year in Manzanillo. It was 82 degrees, with low humidity and a cool breeze blowing from inland instead of from the Pacific, which meant that the weather was a lot less humid than it might have been.
"The port will be ready to begin handling your container ships,"
the port manager told General Han and the small contingent of Chinese military men touring the new facility with him. Han nodded approvingly. This site sure had changed a lot since his previous visit. Over the last 10 years, China Ocean Shipping Company, also known as COSCO, had been investing heavily in developing deep-water ports all over the world to increase the accessibility of Chinese goods to various countries and regions around the world. One of their key investments in the last 6 years had been in Mexico. COSCO had made a $5 billion investment in expanding and upgrading the port of Manzanillo and the port of Ensenada. In addition to these ports, COSCO had also invested heavily in nearby rail yards, bridges, and highways that helped connect the ports with various manufacturing centers in Mexico, bringing more Chinese products to market faster. They had also helped build out the Mexican oil and natural gas fields, something the Chinese economy was aggressively looking to expand anywhere in the world they could.
"What about the tent cities? When will they start to go up?"
asked one of the Chinese soldiers, who was dressed in civilian clothing for this visit. A Mexican soldier replied,
"We begin setting them up tonight. Once we start, it'll be an around-the-clock operation. Within 4 days, we should have enough housing for roughly 10,000 people. Within a week, it'll double. By the end of January, the camp will be able to house roughly 50,000.
"What about the port of Ensenada?
Will it be ready for our ships?"
asked General Han.
"Yes, we have tents already set up there, with more going up as we speak,"
answered another Mexican official from the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs office. He was smartly dressed in a suit.
"We received the shipment of tents and containerized housing units last month from you, and got them all pre-staged, just as you requested. The airports will also be closed starting tomorrow, as you wished, to allow for your airliners to begin operations."
Han nodded. "In 24 hours, tens of thousands of my countrymen are going to arrive, along with a Chinese army group. The Americans are going to apply enormous political pressure to your government. Are you sure your president is going to be able to hold out against that pressure and will not cave to the American demands?" he asked sternly. The Mexican official stuck his chin out with pride.
"President Lopez wholeheartedly agrees with Secretary General Baer. Sachs is a danger to the world and needs to be removed. Mexico will no longer be used as an American puppet."
"Excellent," General Han said, softening his expression. "Let us continue with our tour then." They resumed their walk around the new terminals and cranes. In the end, Han was satisfied. This site was already prepared to begin offloading an entire Chinese army group. December 27th, 2020, Ontario, Canada, Canadian Forces Base, Petawawa. The weather was still relatively warm, hovering somewhere around the high 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but threatening more snow. The weather forecast projected there to be a couple of inches of the wet, fluffy stuff, but it should let up then for the next week or so before another front rolled in. General Mackenzie looked at the sky one more time before walking into the building. Soon they'd have to move to the Cold War-era command bunker at North Bay. However, until the fighting started in earnest, they would continue to use their standard facilities. Mackenzie reached for the door handle and made his way into the headquarters building for the 4th Canadian Division. Each time he walked in, it was more crowded and busier than his last visit, but that made sense. This building had essentially become the de facto headquarters for a rapidly growing UN peacekeeping force that was steadily building up across Canada. Each day, dozens upon dozens of commercial airliners brought in thousands of soldiers from Europe and the other nations that were contributing forces to the UN. General Mackenzie made his way down the hall toward one of the 2 main briefing rooms. He was eager to get an update on what was transpiring both in the Atlantic and along the Pacific coast of Mexico. One of the young officers saw Mackenzie enter the room and shouted, "Attention!" The senior officers from the multinational command stood as he made his way to the center of the conference table. When he took his seat, everyone else took theirs, and the meeting officially began. "Where do we stand with regard to the American blockade?" Mackenzie asked, placing his reading glasses on so he could see the PowerPoint slides more clearly. The German naval officer cleared his throat. "The Americans are going to move their Carrier Strike Group 2, which consists of the carrier G.W. Bush and her escorts, to take up station in the North Atlantic. Our sources tell us the carriers Truman and Ford are also preparing to set sail for the Atlantic before the end of the year." "How many ships are a part of the current strike group that's taken up position off the Canadian coast?" asked Mackenzie. "Aside from the carrier, they have the Philippine Sea, which is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, along with the destroyers Truxtun, Roosevelt, and Arleigh Burke," the German officer explained. One of the Americans, Captain Eli Tapper, interjected, "You can also bet that strike group is going to be traveling with at least 2 submarines, probably 3, if I had to guess." Mackenzie turned to the man with interest. He knew the young captain had been passed over for a promotion after making some disparaging remarks about Sachs, but he needed to feel out his level of loyalty. "Captain Tapper, we're clearly headed toward a military confrontation with your country, one that is going to involve attacking some of your fellow naval officers. I would understand if you feel like you can't participate in that discussion." Bristling a bit at the comment, Tapper just shook his head. "This is my country, and a madman has seized power. If removing him means I must wage war against some of my former colleagues, then so be it. I'll let history be my judge." General Mackenzie nodded. "Very well, then. If you were going to break this blockade, how would you do it?" He knew Captain Tapper had 28 years of experience in the U.S. military and had been working for the Chief of Naval Operations before he'd left Norfolk, so his opinion might provide a valuable key to scoring a quick victory that could end this war before it really got underway. Leaning forward before he replied, Tapper asked, "What forces do I have available to work with so I can make an educated proposal?" The German naval officer answered, "Between the French, German, Italian, and Norwegian navies, we have 12 submarines, 14 frigates and destroyers, and 2 light carriers." With a thick accent, the lone Russian naval officer added, "My country is also willing to commit our northern fleet and submarines to this grand endeavor. Even now, our ships are being made ready in Murmansk and will set sail as soon as the request is made." Turning to look at the Russian, Captain Tapper asked, "What ships exactly are you willing to commit? I ask because, make no mistake, most of the ships in this fleet may get destroyed. However, I believe I may be able to help ensure that we also take out at least one American carrier and most of its strike group. That may not sound like a fair swap, but I can assure you, the one thing the American Navy is averse to is losing ships, particularly carriers. And they don't like to risk taking high casualties either. The Russian officer snickered at the comment. Yes, America does not engage in a fight unless it can be assured of complete victory. I agree with you, Captain. We may lose most of our combined fleet, but if we can sink a couple of carrier strike groups, it will have been worth it. I have been instructed to say that most of our northern fleet, 16 surface warships and 18 submarines, are available for this operation. Smiles spread across the faces of the other naval officers when the Russians said they'd be willing to essentially commit the bulk of their Atlantic fleet. They were by far committing more of their resources to this fight than their EU counterparts. Then again, they also had a lot more to gain from the destruction of, or at least heavy damaging of, the American Atlantic Fleet. Captain Tapper turned back to General Mackenzie. With a fleet this size, I believe we can bust through the American blockade and allow a substantial amount of supplies and reinforcements from Europe to make it to Canadian ports. However, once our combined fleet attacks, you need to make sure the supply ships move as fast as they can for the ports. They can't dawdle. If they wait too long, I can assure you the U.S. Navy will hunt them down and destroy them. After the thumping we're about to give them, they'll be looking for revenge. I'll also make sure your ground forces are ready to move. Once the naval fight kicks off, I can almost guarantee you Saxe will order the Army and Air Force to begin their own attacks in retaliation. The group continued to talk for another hour as the various officers went over some of their ship's capabilities with the American naval officer, calculating how they could best defeat the American blockade with the forces they had. It was going to be a tough battle, considering that it would be taking place in the winter weather of the North Atlantic. However, General Mackenzie felt increasingly confident of their chances of victory, especially if American air power was largely grounded because of inclement weather. When General Mackenzie had finished going over the naval picture, he took a walk further down the hall to the Army and Air Force group. They had been going over various possible battle plans for several days. Thus far, the militia forces inside the U.S. had been providing them with near constant reports and updates on what U.S. Army units were moving toward the border and where they were setting up their camps. They'd also been keeping an eye on where the Army was establishing some of its supply depots to keep their fighting force equipped. A big part of Mackenzie's strategy was for his forces to take out these depots. If they could disrupt their supply chain, it would hinder their ability to respond to his forces' movements. The militia units would also tie down thousands of soldiers as they sought to maintain law and order. Part of the way into the brief, General Mackenzie turned to look at his air chief, a French general. "How are we going to handle the onslaught of American bombers and cruise missiles that will be thrown at us once the war officially starts?" he asked. "We have a plan to deal with the American aircraft, but as to their cruise missiles, we are not as confident. We've begun to set up CRAM systems around some of our critical bases and other missile interceptor systems, but we have a limited capacity to defend against such weapons. However," the Frenchman said, as he gestured toward a Chinese general, "our Asian colleagues have a surprise waiting for the Americans once the war starts. He won't share all the details, but he's assured us that within the first day of the war, many of the bases housing the American bombers will be attacked and destroyed. If they are able to neutralize the enemy bombers, then we'll have a lot fewer cruise missiles to have to contend with." "What about air defenses?" asked Mackenzie. "The Americans are going to hammer us with F-22, F-35, F-16, and F-15 fighters like we've never seen. How are we going to defend against that?" Clearing his throat, A Russian colonel responded. Very easily. We've deployed multiple S-300 and S-400 integrated air defense systems. I assure you, this won't be like attacking Iraq or Syria. We've deployed the best air defense systems in the world. We'll see how tough the vaunted American Air Force is when it has to fight a Tier 1 military and not some raghead Muslim extremist group. A few of his Chinese and European counterparts chuckled at the comment, but Mackenzie wasn't having any of it. He stood up and placed his hands on the table as he looked down at his officers. You all may think this is humorous, but let me tell you something. We're about to wage war on the toughest, most determined, most combat-hardened military in the world. If you think for an instant this is going to be an easy fight, you're in for a huge surprise. Don't forget, the Americans have been in a state of war for the past 19 years. Their soldiers know how to fight, even if they've been fighting Muslim extremists. The average American soldier has seen more combat in a 4-year enlistment than any of you have in your entire career. On top of that, their average citizen is armed. And while some may view us as liberators, many more will view us as invaders. He sighed briefly as he turned away, then looked back at them. Don't underestimate them, he warned. When this war kicks off, they're going to hit us with everything they have. We'll be lucky if we still have an air force by the 4th or 5th day of this war, if the Chinese aren't successful in blunting their bombers. Knowing this, I expect you all to plan for every contingency and be ready to execute at a moment's notice. We could be given the go order any day now. You need to be ready for when it comes. When he'd concluded his speech, he abruptly left the room. He shook his head as he walked down the hallway. We're going to get murdered when this war starts if these guys think it's going to be a walk in the park, Mackenzie thought. Just then his security smartphone buzzed. Looking down at the phone, he saw a short text from Johann. What happened with Spock? We need to move on Omega. Mackenzie was frustrated with the whole Spark plan. The Germans were certain it would work, but he wasn't so sure. It relied on using a private military company to carry out the assassination, rather than one of their direct action special force units. Invariably, someone found out about the plan and they tipped off the American FBI and Secret Service. The media had a field day with the attempted assassination. In the end, all it had achieved was to add further anti-UN fuel to the fire brewing in America. Pentagon, National Military Command Center. What do you mean the Chinese just offloaded a combat brigade in Mexico? Demanded the Secretary of Defense. The colonel, who had just finished briefing them on what was happening down south, shook his head. General Pruitt interjected. It's not just Mexico, and it's not just a brigade, Mr. Secretary. The last satellite pass just confirmed at least 2 brigades worth of Russian equipment being offloaded in Mariel, Cuba, which is a medium-sized port 56 miles west of Havana. In Mexico, it appears that at least 3 Chinese brigades worth of equipment has been offloaded in the last several days in Manzanillo, and at least 2 brigades in Ensenada, which is just 86 miles south of San Diego. How in the hell did we not see this happening? McElroy demanded. And what kind of units are being offloaded? The colonel grimaced slightly. Sir, most of our attention has been focused on what has been going on in Canada and along our northern border. We hadn't been paying nearly as much attention to what was going on in Mexico because the government down there has been staying silent on this whole UN peacekeeper army. They didn't have any forces participating in the exercise, so we'd focused our attention on the other nations. This is unacceptable, McElroy said, smacking the table once with an open hand. We need better intelligence on what's going on down there. What is the size and scope of this new force? What units specifically have been brought in? And what other units are en route to join them? What the hell is the Navy doing?
How could they not have seen this massive convoy of forces being delivered just a few 100 miles south of San Diego? McElroy angrily barked in rapid-fire succession. I should have been getting briefs on this for weeks now, McElroy thought as he gave his intelligence professionals the stink eye. The chief of naval operations, Admiral Chester Smith, cleared his throat. Sir, China and Mexico already conduct a large amount of trade between each other. So do Russia and Cuba. These countries already have a steady and consistent schedule of freighters and cargo ships moving between them. It appears that somewhere along the way, the Chinese and Russians swapped out a lot of the normal cargo with military equipment and troops. That's how they were able to move large swaths of forces completely under our nose. I can assure you, we're now fully aware of what they're doing and will move to intercept them if the President orders us to. As much as McElroy would have loved to have the Navy begin searching Chinese and Russian-flagged ships, he knew that wouldn't fly, at least not until hostilities started, and that was something all of them were desperately trying to avoid. Seeing a break in the conversation between the SecDef and the CNO, the colonel providing the brief added, I know no one wants to hear this, but it's hard to say what the full composition of the force arriving in Mexico is until more of the equipment is unloaded and deployed. What does concern us, though, is that in both Mexico and Cuba, it would appear the Chinese and Russians are offloading a myriad of advanced air defense weapon systems. Our satellites in Mexico are showing a number of HQ-19, HQ-26, and HQ-29 systems, which are essentially Chinese versions of the Russian S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile platforms. In Cuba, we're seeing multiple S-300 and S-400 systems intermixed with other tracked anti-aircraft vehicles. It would appear the Russians are looking to turn Cuba into a heavily defended surface-to-air missile platform. Good grief! They'll be able to threaten aircraft flying over the entire state of California and the southern half of the country, not to mention the entire Gulf Coast, McElroy exclaimed angrily. McElroy decided to shift to naval operations, hoping for some better news. Admiral Smith, what is the status of the Pacific and Atlantic fleets? He asked. Are we ready to begin enforcing the blockade, and can we protect our coasts and port facilities? We're obviously a carrier short in the Pacific with the defection of the Nimitz, the CNO replied glumly. We also have 2 carriers down right now for maintenance, though we are doing everything in our power to cut that short and get them operational again. We're probably looking at 4 to 6 weeks before both of them will be ready for action at least. And that said, since we've pulled our ships out of Japan, we've relocated them to our San Diego facilities. Even with the loss of the Nimitz, we'll be ready to enforce a Pacific blockade. The Canadian Navy, along with the Chinese, aren't nearly strong enough to break the blockade. Even if they tried to incorporate the Nimitz into their plans, the carrier is missing its air wing and more than 70% of its crew. They may have the ship in their possession, but at the moment, it's an empty carcass. What are our other options with the Nimitz? Asked Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Peterson. We clearly can't just leave it alone, not with what's brewing. The CNO cringed. We've thought about that, and we do have some recommendations. I was hoping to go over them with you shortly, but we can discuss them now. McElroy nodded for him to go ahead. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, so let's just dispense with the business none of us want to talk about but needs to be said. Admiral Smith let out a deep sigh. We need to take it back, he asserted. Then he held up a hand to forestall any questions. Not only can we not just leave the ship alone to play neutral, we can't risk its technology falling into the hands of the Russians or the Chinese. It's also a massive military and political black eye, leaving the ship anchored in Canadian waters. Those crew videos they've been recording and airing on social media are having a huge negative effect on the rest of the Navy. The SecDef let out his breath in a huff. He was frustrated as hell with the situation.
Admiral Smith was right. Those videos had become a huge problem, not just inside the Navy, but across the DoD. It was causing a lot of folks to question orders at a time when they needed the military to stay unified. "How heavily guarded is the ship?" McElroy asked. Smith leaned in. "We have a source currently on the ship. The sailor is providing us with some good intel about who all is on the ship and what kind of guard force they have. As of this moment, there are no Chinese or Russian sailors on the ship, but that could change. So far, a company of German Marines and a company of French Marines have come on board to provide ship security. Our source has said members of both of these groups have had access to the Combat Information Center and the classified systems there within the CIC. So I can't guarantee that they aren't already sharing that information with their home navies or the rest of the UN Naval Task Force. For all we know, the Chinese and Russians are already being fed information from the French and Germans." Admiral Smith paused for a second before continuing. "The loss of the ship hurt our capabilities in the Pacific. However, the leakage of classified capabilities of the ship, our radar, weapons, and communication systems, is a far bigger concern. For all we know, the Chinese and Russians are already gaining access to what our full capabilities are. In reality, that's probably more damaging to our ability to fight and win than losing the carrier in a battle would have been." McElroy shook his head in frustration. "I figured you'd say that. Okay, if this is what has to happen, how do we do it in the least destructive way? Is there a way we can fly in an assault force and recapture the ship?" he asked. The Marine General leaned forward. "The only way we could successfully land an assault force on the ship is if we can disable the carrier's air defense systems," he explained. "If we can't, then they'd shoot our helicopters down before we even had a chance." Admiral Smith chimed in. "We do have a source on the ship. We could see if they would be able to disable the ship's defensive weapon systems. If they could, do you believe your Marines could take the ship?" The Marine General thought about that for a moment, and a slight smile crept across his face. "It'll get messy, but I believe we could," he concluded. "It'd have to be a lightning-fast raid, but I think I know just the unit to handle it." McElroy perked up at that comment. "Okay then, Admiral. I want you to find out from our source on the ship if they think they can disable the weapons systems. If they can, then I want your Marines ready to take our ship back." With that decision made, McElroy moved on to the main threat that needed to be dealt with. "What's the situation on the other coast? What's going on with this UN naval force forming up around Iceland?" Admiral Smith shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's brewing up to be a fight, sir. There's no way around it. The UN is clearly not going to back down. At this juncture, most of the world wants to see us knocked down a few rungs. As a consequence, they've bought into this UN lie and they've been sending warships to this growing fleet, believing they can do it. What's concerning is that the NSA has intercepted a flurry of messages between the UN force and the Russians. From what we've gathered, the Russians are committing most of their northern fleet to this fight. When you couple their ships with those of France, Germany, Italy, and Norway, it's shaping up to be quite the force." McElroy frowned. "So, what's your assessment? Do we wait for them to launch the first volley, or do we hit them first?" he asked. "Our standard military doctrine would dictate that we strike them first. The last thing we want to do is wait for them to sort themselves and force us to react to them, as opposed to forcing them to react to us. My concern with Russia, though, is how will they react if we suddenly sink a large portion of their navy? I don't think they would opt to go nuclear, but you can never rule anything out when dealing with the Russians, and the same goes for China." McElroy brushed aside the nuclear concern. "Look, these countries have been warned to stand down," he asserted. "The EU nations should know by now that when we issue a threat, we mean it.
We told the Assad regime that if he used chemical weapons on his people, we'd respond with force. When they used chemical weapons, we hammered the air base that they were launched from. When they tested our resolve a second time, we hammered every facility in their country that was associated with their chemical weapons program. Likewise, we told the Russians if your forces get close to our forces in Syria or attacked our Kurdish allies, we'd attack them. When they disregarded our warning, we slaughtered 200 of their paid mercenaries. Hell, we convinced that madman in North Korea to disarm and abandon his nuclear weapons program because we made it abundantly clear that if he didn't, he wouldn't stay in power for much longer. The EU, China, and Russia know we're not messing around. I want you to go ahead and put together a plan to neutralize this force before they have a chance to attack us. We'll brief it to the president, and if he gives the go-ahead, then we'll execute. The SecDef shifted his gaze to the army officers. We now have a new threat brewing on our southern border in addition to our northern border. How do you propose we handle this? General Vance Pruitt from the Army replied, If we're going to launch a preemptive attack on this naval force, then I'd recommend that we launch a massive preemptive attack on the UN's ground forces as well. We could have the Air Force hammer them with a massive cruise missile strike, and then quickly follow it up with an overwhelming number of airstrikes. Once they've crippled the enemy's Air Force and hammered their ground forces, we'll launch a ground invasion of Canada and Mexico. We'd then move swiftly to crush the enemy force and then withdraw to our own borders. As long as we don't try to stay in Canada or Mexico and occupy any territory, we should be able to complete our combat operations within 6 to 10 weeks at most. The Air Force Chief of Staff added, If we hit their Air Force and air defense systems fast with a preemptive strike, it'll reduce the number of aircraft losses we might otherwise take. We have to remember, a lot of the aircraft we'd be going up against aren't old Cold War airframes. These are Tier 1 NATO aircraft. Many of these nations are fielding the same aircraft we're fielding. Shoot, the Canadians, Norwegians, Dutch, and Italians collectively have 80 F-35s in Canada. The Russians and Chinese have also deployed several air wings of their most advanced aircraft. McElroy nodded his head. I know. All these countries apparently knew a conflict was going to happen and summarily moved in their Tier 1 equipment to Canada in preparation for it. McElroy sighed. It really pisses me off that so many of our European allies completely turned on us when they saw an opportunity to hit us. No one really said anything for a few moments, as they all sat there waiting to see what the SecDef would say or order next. The political situation raging across the country was having a huge impact on the men and women working in the Pentagon. Many of them had colleagues who'd crossed over to the other side, and many more had family members urging them to do the same thing. As Chuck McElroy surveyed the room, he could see the looks of concern and frustration written on many of their faces. He knew he should probably say something encouraging, but he just didn't know what to say. Finally, he figured he'd just be honest and speak from his heart. Look, I know no one is happy about what's going on, and neither am I. None of us asked for this. Outside forces have taken advantage of the situation and figured out how to manipulate social media and our own news services to turn us on each other. Every one of you has a top-secret clearance and has seen the intelligence on what's transpired. While many others in the public may not know the truth or want to accept it, you've seen the raw data. It's our responsibility to make sure these outside forces don't succeed in ripping our country apart from the inside. Do what you need to do to steel yourself for what's about to come, because it's going to get ugly before it gets better. He paused for a moment before turning to General Peterson. I want options to present to the President by COB today. That gives you guys roughly 5 hours. After that, I want everyone to take the next few days to be with your families. Enjoy the downtime with them, because when you get back, things are going to shift into high gear.
With his pep talk done, McElroy got up to head back to his office, leaving the chairman and the Joint Chiefs to work out the details with them before they presented their plan to the president. Come January 3rd, they'd begin preparations to end this standoff once and for all. Bellingham, Washington. Jake Bain was engrossed in a fascinating documentary on the History Channel called The Men Who Built America. He was at least halfway into the episode where Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller began their rivalry to see who could build the largest corporate empire and become the world's richest man, when his wife Marcy called to him. "You want anything from Costco?" Jake didn't hear her. When he didn't reply, Marcy snapped her fingers to get his attention. "Hey, zombie boy, I'm going to Costco. Do you want me to grab you anything?" Jake paused the show, put the remote down, and stood up. "Actually, I think I'll come with you. We can get dinner while we're there if you like." She shook her head and sported an amused grin. When they were dating, they used to eat there rather often when they wanted to have a cheap date. In Jake's mind, nothing quite beat Costco's $1.50 hot dog and drink combo. "Really? A Costco dinner? We're not broke, you know. We can afford McDonald's," she said sarcastically. Jake laughed. "I know, but I like their pizza and those fresh-made churros." Marcy rolled her eyes, but then she smiled. "Okay, fine. You twisted my arm. We can have dinner there. Get your shoes and jacket on." The two of them headed out the door and climbed into his Ford F-150. It wasn't too far of a drive, only about 10 minutes from their subdivision. As they traveled down the lightly snow-dusted road, Jake gave the dash a little pat. "Man, I love this truck," he remarked quietly. When he'd gotten back from his deployment to the Middle East at the end of 2016, Jake had spent a month shopping for a new truck until he'd found his F-150 Lariat on a DEA auction block down in Seattle. He'd made a few inquiries with some of his law enforcement contacts in the city and was able to bid on the truck. Fortunately for him, he'd won and snagged the truck for a song. He'd purchased the 2-year-old truck, which would normally retail for around $30,000, for $21,000. Of course, it had a few bullet holes that needed to be patched up and some body work that needed to be done, but Jake didn't mind. It was the truck he'd always wanted. "You think it's going to snow much?" Marcy asked. Jake turned on the windshield wipers to push the melting snow from the window. Not taking his eyes off the road, he replied, "Not sure. I didn't see any news alerts about a snowstorm, but I could have missed something." As they drove down the road, Jake's eyes were constantly on alert, checking and double-checking everything on the sides of the road and looking for anything that might be out of the ordinary. When they'd approached a parked car on the side of the road, he'd inspect the rear tires in the back of the car to see if they were sitting lower than the rest of the car. His eyes darted about, searching for signs of a new patch on the road or garbage that looked out of place. He might have returned home from the war, but his mind and his instincts were still very much in the thick of the combat that had nearly killed him several years ago. When Jake and Marcy drove into the parking lot, Jake noticed how packed it was. "Is there a sale going on or something?" he asked. She laughed. "No, it's always this busy on Saturdays." He felt his forehead scrunching up involuntarily. "I guess I'm usually at home when you make these Costco or Walmart runs," he remarked. Jake hated the feelings of anxiety he'd get when he was around large groups of people, or the fact that he couldn't control any of the situations happening around him. Aside from his job with the county, he usually only ventured outside his house to go to church, visit the VFW Lodge a couple times a month, and make his once-a-month journey to the rifle range with a couple of old Army buddies. Jake found an empty handicapped spot and pulled in. He made sure his placard was in the window so he wouldn't get a ticket. He and Marcy got out of the truck and walked over to grab a cart. Marcy showed the greeter at the door her membership card and was waved in. As they walked past the giant TVs on sale, the two of them saw a news program playing. "Hostilities between the U.S. and UN forces seem almost inevitable at this point," one anchor commented. A small group of people gathered around the television set, speaking to each other in hushed tones and glancing at each other with nervous looks. Jake decided not to linger. They made their way down the main hallway toward the meat department and the bakery. Jake had his eyes set on some New York strip steaks for tomorrow's dinner. As they headed deeper into the store, Marcy touched him on the shoulder. "I know this isn't what you want to hear, babe, but I'm glad you aren't in the army anymore," she remarked. "Not with all these talks of a possible war with the UN." The army was still a sore subject for Jake. He'd spent 10 years on active duty as an explosive ordnance disposal guy before deciding to get out, burned out after all the deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan during the height of those wars. When he'd returned to Washington, his mother had suggested he get a job working for Whatcom County, where she worked. There was an opening for an assistant city planner, and since he did have a BS in civil engineering, he was very likely to get the job. Sure enough, he'd applied, interviewed, and gotten the position. While he liked working for the county government, it had been boring him to tears. He'd gone from defusing IEDs on the side of roads to navigating endless red tape just to get a pothole filled or a new children's park built. 3 years after leaving active duty, Jake had decided he didn't want his 10 years of federal service to go to waste, so he joined the Washington State Army National Guard, which also had an EOD unit. 3 years into his stint with them, he'd been deployed to support special forces in Iraq and Syria fighting ISIS. During the last month of his deployment, Jake had been nearly blown up trying to disarm an IED. The explosion had sadly cost him his left leg just below the knee, and he'd sustained a traumatic brain injury from the blast. After 4 months at Walter Reed, he'd been sent home for continued care. Unfortunately, his time in the Guard had to end. He'd been granted a 100% disability rating from the VA and had used some of the money to buy his truck. After that, he'd done his best to put everything behind him and focus on his job at the county. Jake looked over at Marcy, who nearly had tears in her eyes. "I know, babe," he answered. "I'm glad I'm out of the military as well. I'm concerned about this UN army invading our country, though. You know, our city will fall behind enemy lines pretty quickly if a fight does happen." When they entered the bakery section of the store, Marcy grabbed a container of the freshly made butter croissants and placed them in the cart along with some assorted muffins. "Hey, what's with all the pastries?" Jake asked. Because it's our small group's turn to bring snacks to church tomorrow," Marcy answered, chuckling. "Oh, man, I forgot about that. Thanks for remembering." As they continued through the store, Jake saw a lot of people stocking up on water bottles and other bulk items one typically associated with preparing for a long winter storm. Marcy asked, "Do you think we should buy anything in case stuff does go down between the U.S. and the UN?" "Are you telling me you're concerned too?" he said playfully. "I'm just trying to be prepared, that's all," she shot back. Jake shrugged his shoulders. "Sure, we can stock up on some items, but they aren't going to be the type of items you'd normally think of," he replied. He took over pushing the cart and headed down a couple of aisles that didn't have a lot of people in them. First, he grabbed 2 types of coffee, a couple of brands of instant coffee, and about twice as many bags of the regular coffee you make with a filter. Next, he grabbed a couple boxes of coffee filters. Seeing that the cart was nearly full, he told Marcy, "I'm going to go grab another cart. Be right back." She gave him a quizzical look but didn't say anything. This was his wheelhouse, and she knew it. A few moments later, he returned with one of those large flatbed carts. "Whoa, cowboy, what are you doing?" she asked, flabbergasted. "I said we could get a few items, not stock up like it's the end of the world." He laughed at the comment.
I'm not stocking up for the end of the world. I'm just rounding out my stash of goods I already have. With what, like 10 years' worth of coffee? Hey, what you don't know about coffee is that it's one of the most tradable luxury items you can have. You have to think about bartering, babe. You need something of value that people want. That, my dear, is coffee, along with a few other goods we'll be grabbing. Uh-huh. Well, I'm glad we brought your truck then. For the next 2 hours, they wandered through Costco, stocking up on a host of dry goods and canned items that Jake knew they could trade for other goods, should there come to be a shortage. When they left the store, he loaded everything up and told Marcy, "I need to make one more stop at the liquor store next to the building before we leave." He returned with several cases of hard alcohol and a box of their favorite red wine. "Tradable goods, right," Marcy said sarcastically. Clearly, she wasn't buying it. Shrugging his shoulders, Jake finished loading up the back bay of his truck and hopped in. "Seriously, what's with all the booze?" she pressed. "Alcohol can be used for a lot more purposes than just getting drunk," he explained. "You can use it to disinfect a wound or help cut down on the pain if you have to stitch something up. Heck, you can even use it to run a generator if you have to. Besides, it is a valuable trading item." The rest of their drive was relatively quiet. The further outside of town they got, the less traffic they encountered, until they came to their little subdivision. It wasn't anything fancy, but at least the houses weren't stacked on top of each other. Jake drove the truck around to the back, where he'd had a small 2-car garage shed built. It was his unofficial man cave and workshop. He'd also had a false floor built inside, which led to a buried 20-foot shipping container he had turned into his end-of-the-world supply bunker. That was where he stored most of his valuable prepper gear, along with his rifles and ammunition. Inside the garage, he maintained 5 shelves of dried goods and a small supply of ammo, to give the appearance that this was his main stash. But in reality, it was meant to act as a ruse should anyone actually try to search the place. Jake figured if he gave up something they might be looking for, they'd assume victory and leave. Chapter 7. Bishop for a Pawn. Kingston, New York. New York Army National Guard. Captain J. Peeler was anxious as they turned down North Manor Avenue, near the National Guard Armory. The 1st Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, had been tasked with securing the various National Guard armories around the state. The last thing the federal government wanted was for these weapons and equipment to fall into the hands of the New York Civil Defense Force. They were already having a problem with close to 30% of the National Guard members going AWOL. "We're coming up on the armory now," announced the vehicle commander. A moment later, he abruptly let out a stream of obscenities. "Hey, I think we've got a problem, sir." "What do you mean we have a problem?" asked Captain Peeler. The vehicle then came to a halt, and the driver called out, "What do you want me to do?" "Stand by while we figure it out," the vehicle commander ordered. "Sir, it looks like they've moved one of their guardians to block the entrance to the armory," the driver observed. Captain Peeler looked at the monitor and promptly realized this was going to be an issue. "Give me the radio, would you?" he asked. A soldier handed him the handset. "All warrior elements prepare for possible contact. Break." He released the talk button for a brief moment. "I want Warrior 4 to pull alongside my vehicle. I want Lieutenant Drake and Master Sergeant Willis to come to my vehicle. Out." Captain Peeler handed the radio back to the soldier next to him. Then he looked at the soldiers standing in the back of the striker vehicle. Their faces betrayed their nerves. "Listen up, soldiers," he told them. "We've been given orders to secure this facility and make sure the weapons and equipment don't fall into the wrong hands. We can't afford for the New York militia to take these weapons and vehicles. If they do, they'll most likely use them against us at a later date. I need you all to stay calm and ready for action. If those National Guardsmen decide to fire on us,
then you guys need to return fire and try to end this swiftly. Okay?" The soldiers reluctantly nodded, unsure of what might come next. The vehicle commander lowered the rear hatch, which let in the cold winter air. While there wasn't snow on the ground yet, it was certainly cold enough for it. Master Sergeant Willis and Lieutenant Drake both walked up to him. At least 2 squads of soldiers had dismounted from their vehicles and were now milling around behind them. "Drake, Willis, I'm going to walk up there and try to sort this whole thing out. If by some chance they shoot me or try to shoot at us, then I need you to take over, Drake. Listen to Willis here and seize that armory. Go ahead and send one of your squads around to the rear of the building. We don't know how many guardsmen are there or what their intentions are. For all we know, they could have deployed that vehicle to guard the place against possible militia units, but we need to find out." "Sir, if you don't mind, I'd like to move Warrior 3 in place of your vehicle," asserted Master Sergeant Willis. "It's equipped with a cannon. If they shoot at you with that vehicle, then I'm going to tell our gunner to take it out." Nodding in agreement, Lieutenant Drake added, "I think he's right, sir. With Warrior 3 in my own vehicle, that gives us the 105 and the 50 cal if we need it." "Okay. Do it while I get some sort of white flag ripped up to walk out there," Captain Peeler replied. "Make sure we send at least 1 squad, if not a platoon, around to the rear of the armory. I don't want them to try and stall us while guys are running out the back with weapons in hand." The next couple of minutes were tense. They saw several guardsmen come out of the building and take up defensive positions, which made the 10th Mountain guys nervous that this might actually turn into a shooting match. Meanwhile, one of the platoons took off at a trot into the nearby woods. They'd move a few hundred meters into the woods before they turned north to get themselves tucked away behind the armory. It being winter, there wasn't a lot of underbrush to keep them hidden, so they had to move further away than they wanted to before they turned to head north. At this point, a lot of civilians were coming out of their homes to see what all the commotion was. The soldiers shooed them away, telling them they needed to stay indoors. One of the women said she was calling the cops. Captain Peeler finally got a white oil rag they had in the truck tied to one of their spare radio antennas. When he walked outside the back of the Stryker, he heard a police siren. A police cruiser approached, but stopped maybe 100 yards away from them. I'd probably stop too, if I saw 60 or 70 heavily armed soldiers and 10 Stryker vehicles, Peeler thought, holding back a chuckle. "Captain, you want to deal with this before you head up to the armory?" asked his first sergeant. Peeler sighed, then walked toward the rear of their position. When he got to the last Stryker vehicle, a second squad car had shown up. The 4 officers got out of their car, guns drawn but not aimed at the soldiers, at least not yet. The fact that the police officers had their guns out of their holsters and in their hands caused a platoon's worth of soldiers to bring their weapons to the low ready. If these cops thought they were going to order them to vacate the premises, they had another thing coming. Walking toward the police cars, Peeler called out, "I'm Captain Peeler from Fort Drum. We're not here to cause you guys any trouble, but I'm going to need you to stand down." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw at least one civilian with their smartphone out, probably recording everything that was going on. Great. All I need is for this to get posted to YouTube, and God knows where else, Peeler thought. "What are you guys doing here?" shouted one of the police officers. "We're here to secure the weapons and vehicles at the armory. We're not here to cause any trouble." One of the officers called out, "The governor said those weapons and vehicles belong to the people of New York." Almost laughing at the statement, Peeler replied, "Really? Because last time I checked, those are military vehicles and military-grade weapons. They belong to the U.S. Army, not the state of New York. Now we're going to go up there and secure the armory, and you guys are going to leave. If you opt to interfere with our operation, we'll be forced to disarm you and hold you until we're done." A couple of the cops looked nervous. One of them looked super agitated and angry. That officer said something to his fellow officers before he raised his sidearm toward Captain Peeler. From somewhere behind Peeler, a shot rang out and the officer dropped dead from a bullet directly to the head. As soon as the officer was shot, two of the other officers instantly raised their own sidearms. They were both cut down by a series of shots fired by Peeler's men before he could even yell out for everyone to remain calm. The last police officer dropped his pistol and raised his hands high, obviously hoping he wasn't about to get ripped apart by these soldiers. Captain Peeler could hear several urgent calls taking place over the radio as the soldiers near the front of their little convoy called out to find out what was going on. Then, out of nowhere, he heard the unmistakable sound of a 50 cal heavy machine gun firing a dozen or so rounds. Turning around, Peeler yelled out, "Who fired those shots?" Before anyone could respond, the striker equipped with a 105mm cannon fired, piercing the air of this quiet neighborhood, probably unlike any noise they'd ever heard before. Boom! The Guardian vehicle exploded, further rocking the neighborhood. Then rapid gunfire ensued as at least a dozen soldiers began firing at the guardsmen around the armory. The shooting lasted for maybe 2 or 3 minutes before someone called out for them to stop. Several of the guardsmen who hadn't been killed threw their weapons down and held their hands up. The soldiers advanced on them as they moved rapidly to secure them and the building. Captain Peeler walked past one of his striker vehicles and saw that it had sustained a fair bit of damage from the Guardian's 50 caliber machine gun. Then he turned his attention to the Guardian and discovered a burning wreck. 5 or 6 dead National Guardsmen lay dead on the ground nearby, and a handful of his soldiers were grouping the remaining guardsmen together and zip-tying them. This is a freaking disaster, Peeler thought to himself as he made his way into the armory. He started barking orders to his men to start securing the weapons, military vehicles, radios, night vision equipment, and any other military equipment at the armory. While his guys were busy doing that, he grabbed his smartphone and placed a call back to battalion headquarters. He needed to let them know what had happened here. It wouldn't be long before this was blown up all over the internet. Why did that cop have to try and shoot at us? Peeler thought in disgust. The guardsmen had probably fired because they thought his men were firing on them. What a mess. December 30th, 2020, Fort Stewart, Georgia. Major General Robert Dickman had his hands on his hips as he watched the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank get loaded into the last rail car. A handful of soldiers and contractors guided the driver as he deftly maneuvered the 71-ton monster onto the flat car. Once it was strapped down, the long line of rail cars transporting the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team would begin their journey across the country to Syracuse, New York. The destination had been chosen because it had a major railhead, and it would place the division close to Fort Drum, which was near the Montreal-Ottawa side of the Canadian border. Another group would go to Buffalo, which was closer to the Hamilton and Toronto side. These were the 2 most likely routes where the UN peacekeepers would try to cross into the U.S., and where most of their military buildup was taking place. Turning to look at the train engineer standing beside him, General Dickman asked, "How many days did you say it'll take to get to Syracuse?" The engineer briefly looked down at his clipboard before he replied, "Day and a half. We'll pretty much be driving non-stop. I was told you guys have a crew up there, ready to handle the offloading." Dickman nodded. "Yeah, we sent an advance party up there 3 days ago. They've been getting the camp ready." The engineer sighed. "Well, if you don't have anything else for me, General, I'll head on up and make sure everything is ready. We should be underway within the hour." "That should do it. Sorry you guys pulled this kind of duty," General Dickman said in a conciliatory tone. "Hopefully all this posturing will be just that, posturing." The engineer snorted. "Well, if the UN decides they want to cross into our country, you guys give them hell.
"We don't need no foreign military in our country, if you ask me," he said in a thick Georgian accent. He spat a stream of tobacco juice on the ground and then trudged off to do his checks before he got under way. Dickman took one last look at the train before turning to head back to his vehicle. It was a short drive back to his headquarters, and he had opted to drive himself. There was no need to make a soldier drive him around. He was doing his best to give as many of his troopers as possible time off to be with their families before things got crazy and the rest of the division left the base. The current plan had them all boarding a series of commercial airliners, Air Force troop transports, and trains the day after New Year's. The entire division would descend on Syracuse on January 2nd. They had orders from the President to be ready to begin combat operations by January 15th, and he fully planned on being ready to roll when the order was given. East Syracuse, New York, CSX Terminal. The CSX manager sat in his office with Colonel Jose Bender from the 3rd Infantry Division and 2 of his officers. "You know, we're catching a lot of grief from the state and local government for letting you guys use our facility," he said before he unwrapped a stick of gum and started chewing it with a smirk. Colonel Bender was momentarily distracted by the view outside the window. The snow was starting to come down steadily now. He returned his gaze to the rail yard manager. "I wish I could tell you something to ease your concern, Mike, but we're just doing what we're told," he said. "I do have the check your company requested, all $790,000 you guys said it'd cost for us to use your facility for the next 5 days. If we need more time, we'll let you know." The CSX manager reached over and took the government-issued check, examined it to make sure it was for the agreed-upon amount, and then placed it in a desk drawer for his secretary to collect on Monday when she came in. Most of the workers at the rail yard had been given the day off to be with their families, since the company had turned the holiday into a 4-day weekend. "I sure hope you all know what you're doing," Mike responded. "I know a lot of people around here aren't going to be happy when the rest of your unit shows up here in a couple of days. Not everyone agrees with the visible presence of the Army or the National Guard. You know, they sent our local National Guard unit down to Alabama and sent us a Guard unit from Georgia." When the governor of New York had attempted to activate the state's National Guard units, President Sachs had federalized them and sent them south. This was when 30% had broken off and formed the New York Civil Defense Force. That had been the catalyst for a whole series of events. A day later, the governors in several other states led by Democrats had begun to form their own militias, but that had been followed by multiple Republican governors doing the same. Tensions had risen nationwide, and there was a general sense among the population that battle lines were being drawn. Colonel Bender just shrugged. "Well, we're here to make sure those UN peacekeepers know to stay out of our country. Hopefully this whole mess will get resolved without anyone having to get hurt, and we can go back to normal." With their business done, the colonel signaled for his men to leave. As they got up and headed out into the wintry mix, one of the other officers asked, "Do you think the governor's militia force is going to cause us some problems?" "You mean the New York Civil Defense Force?" Colonel Bender asked, crossing his arms. "No. They're a bunch of untrained, under-equipped, poorly read ragtag civilians who are pretending to play at Army." The officer who'd asked the question snorted, but said nothing. They continued their walk through the snow silently. Soon they climbed into their JLTV vehicle and headed out of the rail yard to a makeshift camp their advance party had been working on establishing in a nearby forest, adjacent to the CSX train yard. The clearing was a relatively wide-open area, with a road that connected to the train yard and was flanked on 2 sides by a nature conservation area. The only downside to the location was its close proximity to a high school and a middle school. After a relatively silent ride down the road, they eventually came to the main entrance of their new camp. Rolls of concertina wire had been strung up around the perimeter,
to deter people from trying to check the area out. The entrance was also manned by 5 soldiers from the advance party, who did a quick check of Colonel Bender and his crew's IDs before they waved them in. As Bender and his men pulled into the camp, they saw dozens of large tents that had been erected in the forested area. The soldiers were doing their best to situate the tents between the trees, keeping as much of the open area as possible cleared for the vehicles and tanks that were due to arrive in 2 days. Despite all the progress, they still had a lot of work to get this place set up and ready. The initial goal was to turn this place into a supply depot, since it was close to the rail yard, but a long-term camp was being put together outside the city, closer to Buffalo. The 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team was a heavy tank unit, and tanks need room to maneuver, something they wouldn't have if they stayed in the city limits. After parking their JLTV in front of the newly established command tent, Colonel Bender and his 2 officers got out and headed in to check on the progress of the other camp. Bender made a beeline toward a map board, which was hanging from some 550 cord along one of the tent walls. "Parker, give me a status update on the new camp," he said briskly. Captain Parker, one of his newly promoted captains, grunted and nodded. "Yes, sir. Major Corker from the 9th Engineer Battalion said his unit is getting the Camillus Forest Unique area set up. He said to tell you they'll have the area ready to start receiving the brigade once they start to arrive. However, he also wanted me to tell you that they ran into a problem with the local sheriff." "What type of problem did they encounter?" Bender asked cautiously. "He said the sheriff wanted to pass them a warning. He'd apparently heard word that the local militia defense force had made some threats in town about possibly attacking any federal soldiers that move into the area." Colonel Bender shook his head. "Did the sheriff say if he was investigating it, or was he just passing along the information?" Captain Parker shrugged his shoulders. "Major Corker didn't say. He did want to know if we could spare any additional soldiers to increase their guard force. He also wanted to know what his rules of engagement were, in case they were attacked." Colonel Bender sighed at the question. "Okay, listen up, people," he shouted. "This is the last time I want to go over the rules of engagement. We've gone over this before, and I don't care if we're in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, or freaking New York City. The rules are the same. If someone is shooting at you, or is posing an imminent threat to your life, or the lives of your soldiers, or innocent civilians, you have been authorized to use deadly force. For better or worse, and whether we agree with it or not, the entire country is under martial law, and has been for the last 6 weeks. The public has been made fully aware that they aren't to threaten or attack federal or National Guard soldiers. If they do, deadly force has been authorized and will be used. Period. No more asking me what the ROEs are. They haven't changed. So get used to them and enforce them." Bender popped his knuckles and then turned back to the captain. "What is the status of the 1st Battalion, 67th Armor? Have their soldiers arrived yet?" he asked. Parker nodded. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Flute reported in a half an hour ago that they landed at the Syracuse-Hancock Airport. They are working with the Air Force to collect their vehicles now that the C-5s have arrived." Colonel Bender's expression warmed into a smile. "How much of their equipment is arriving on this first trip?" Captain Parker looked down at the clipboard on the table next to the map board, then read off the first load. 12 Bradleys, 16 of our heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, our HEMTTs, and 14 of our M113 tracked vehicles. The Air Force also brought about 60 of our standard 463L pallets, mostly food, ammunition, and other critical items we'll need right off the bat to get started." "Excellent work. Best news I've heard all day," said Bender with a nod. "Tell Major Corker that as soon as 1st Battalion has collected their equipment from the Air Force, they'll head his way to shore up his positions. We'll continue to work with our skeleton crew here until the rest of the main body starts to arrive in a couple of days." The advance party would be incredibly busy over the next 72 hours or so, getting ready for the pending arrival of 3,800 soldiers and hundreds of tanks. The one exception to the busy schedule Colonel Bender was making was his concession to allow all his soldiers time to visit the local Denny's or IHOP for a solid New Year's Eve lunch or dinner. They might be deploying for a possible fight along the Canadian border, and until that threat materialized, he was determined to allow his troopers to have a decent holiday meal on the local economy. Watertown, New York. As he drove down Arsenal Street, Roy started to slow down. He flipped his right blinker on, then turned down Breen Avenue, driving past Pete's Trattoria. He went a little further down the road and then pulled into someone's driveway briefly so he could back out and turn around. Then he drove past a few houses until he stopped his truck near the front entrance of the fine Italian restaurant. Not seeing a lot of cars in the parking lot, Roy began to think they might have come a bit too early. He knew he couldn't leave the truck running on the side of the street with his hazards on if they had to sit down and wait inside the place. So he pulled his truck into the parking lot. He made sure to back his truck into its space so he could peel out of the parking lot when the time came. Looking to his right, he saw Dylan checking his Glock for what must have been the 10th time since he'd picked him up and given him the weapon 30 minutes ago. "Stop fiddling with that thing. You're going to shoot yourself, not these soldiers," Roy snapped at his partner. "Sorry, I guess I'm just a bit nervous, that's all," Dylan replied. "Look, we've gone over this a couple of times already," Roy asserted. "We know that every night there are several soldiers eating at this place, either by themselves or with their families. We're going to walk in there, find them, and shoot them, just like in The Sopranos, okay? This isn't any different. Now let's get going and do this thing." Roy proceeded to get out of the truck, leaving it running so all they had to do was hop in and get out of Dodge. Roy Cutter was the newly appointed CDF leader for Jefferson County, which included Watertown, the next largest city adjacent to Fort Drum, home of the 10th Mountain Division. A couple of days earlier, Roy had been given orders to start assassinating soldiers from the base. They needed to send a message to the soldiers that they were not welcome in New York. The two of them got out and walked towards the front door of the Italian restaurant. Dylan grabbed the door and held it open for Roy as he walked in. They stopped briefly at the hostess's stand and scanned the restaurant for any soldiers or people dressed in civilian clothes that looked like soldiers. "Just the two of you?" asked the college-aged woman as she grabbed a couple of menus. With his train of thought broken, Roy stumbled. I'm sorry, what did you say?" Smiling, the woman repeated her question, to which Roy nodded. "Sorry, yes, it's just the two of us. Can we sit at that table over there, by the wall?" he asked. "Sure thing, sir. Just follow me," she replied. The hostess guided them over to their table. "Your waitress will be here shortly with some glasses of water, ready to take your orders," she said. When she left, Dylan asked, "What do we do now? I don't see any soldiers here." Trying not to look angry or mad, Roy replied, "We wait. Just keep your gloves on. I'll order us an appetizer. If we haven't spotted any soldiers walking into the place by the time we're done, we'll go ahead and order dinner. I'm pretty sure we'll see someone walk in by then. If not, then I guess you just got a fancy dinner. Compliments of the CDF." Dylan laughed, but he was clearly nervous. He was starting to sweat. When the waitress brought them their water, his hand had a slight tremor to it as he grabbed the glass. The waitress didn't seem to notice. She took her order pad out. "What can I start you guys with?" Glancing down at the menu, Roy replied, "Can we get an order of your maple bacon Dijon scallops and an order of your tomato bruschetta?" "Sure thing, love. Do you gentlemen want a glass of wine or beer to go with your appetizers or dinner?" "I'll take the standard martini," blurted out Dylan.
I'll have a gin and tonic myself, Roy added as he gave Dillon a glare.
Okay, no problem, guys. I'll get your appetizer order in and bring your drinks over, she said. Then she whirled around and headed off. Once the waitress had left, Roy leaned in and quietly tried to talk his partner down. Dillon, close your eyes and take a deep breath. Pretend you're with that stripper from the other night. Put your mind somewhere else until it's time. You need to calm yourself down. A few minutes went by, and she brought them their drinks. Dillon practically downed his in one sip and ordered a second. Roy whispered to him to go easy on the alcohol. He didn't want him so drunk he couldn't help him out when the time came. Just then the door dinged as some more guests walked into the restaurant. The waitress brought the two couples around to a table not far from them and sat them down. I think these are our targets, Roy said quietly to Dillon. They're in civilian clothes. How do we know they aren't just guys who have a short haircut? I mean, your hair looks the same, Dillon countered. They both hushed up as their waitress brought out their appetizers and their second round of drinks. They ate their appetizers and just listened to the conversation of the two couples a few tables down. Roy eventually heard them say something about their unit possibly being deployed soon. That was it. Now Roy knew for sure they were soldiers. Dillon, this is it, Roy said. I'm going to stand up and walk over to them. I'll shoot both of the men, and then we'll walk out of here, okay? All I want you to do is stand up and be ready, in case someone else pulls a gun or tries to stop us. He pulled his own Glock out from his waistband. Dillon just nodded as Roy stood up and walked toward the two couples. He got within a few feet of them before one of the men noticed him. The soldier had a look of surprise when he saw Roy stop next to their table. Then his facial expression changed. He must have sensed danger. Before the man could react, Roy raised his pistol up and shot the man a few feet from him in the back of his head, splattering blood and brain matter over the couple sitting opposite them. The soldier on the opposite side tried to lunge at Roy, but he'd already shifted his aim and he fired two more shots, which both hit the man in the chest. The two women at the table screamed hysterically at the scene unfolding before them. Roy realized that the second man had been hit by both of his bullets, but he appeared to still be alive. Roy aimed his pistol at the man's head and fired a third shot. As he turned to head out of the restaurant, Roy saw that Dillon was practically frozen in fear. Come on, we need to get out of here, he ordered. He ran past his partner to the front entrance. 2 seconds later, Roy was out the door and racing to his truck. Dillon was hot on his heels. They both swung open the truck doors and hopped in. The engine was still running, and Roy threw the truck into drive and raced out of the parking lot. They could already hear the police sirens wailing in the distance as they turned into Arsenal Street. Now it was a race to make it out of town to their safe house in the countryside. Fortunately for Roy, several police officers in town had already pledged their loyalty to the CDF, so he knew they'd help impede any investigation into the shooting. He just needed to avoid getting caught during his escape. He made a series of elaborate turns, winding down some side roads that would take them through some neighborhoods as they continued to get themselves out of town. A couple of minutes later, Roy started to breathe a lot easier. He was pretty sure that he'd managed to lose his tail. Fort Drum, New York. Major General George Hayes was not a happy camper. 2 of the soldiers in his 10th Mountain Division had been shot dead the night before while eating at a restaurant in town. Not only had the shooter not been caught, but the local police chief was doing nothing to track the people down. It crushed him that 2 of his guys had been killed around Christmas time, and they weren't even in a combat zone yet. One of the majors walked over to General Hayes and handed him a sheet of paper. General, the scout platoon from the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, reports they're in place, he announced. General Hayes hastily read over the report, then nodded in approval. Excellent.
I'm glad the ground wasn't too frozen for them to get those seismic sensors in place. If we'd waited another month, the ground would probably have been too hard, that's for sure, the Major acknowledged. These sensors should give us a heads up if that UN force is on the move or approaches the border, he added. The scout platoon had crossed into Canada the night before and placed a series of seismic sensors along a number of the major approaches the UN force might take. Since the official border between Canada and the U.S. had closed nearly a month ago, the vehicle traffic between the two countries had ground to a halt. Nearly all the traffic now consisted of small clusters of Americans trying to cross into Canada to join the renegade American National Guard units and militia forces. "Is the rest of the 1st Battalion ready to deploy?" asked General Hayes. The Major nodded. "Yes, sir, just as ordered. They'll deploy the day after New Year's and begin setting up their various listening observation posts along our area of operation. The battalion commander did pass along one question. He wanted to know what his guys should do if they encounter any persons trying to cross to either the American or Canadian side. In the past, we would have called the Border Patrol, but that doesn't seem like what we'd do in this instance." Hayes snickered at the thought of calling CPB if they spotted some enemy soldiers or special forces trying to cross into America. "Tell the commander he should detain them until the military force can fetch them. If they're Americans, then we'll let the Provost Marshal and the DOJ handle them. If they're foreign military, well, we'll cross that bridge when we have to." Some of the soldiers in the ops center overheard his comment, and a few nervous laughs erupted. Just then the other general on the base, Hayes's deputy, Brigadier General Don Whitman, came into the room with a serious look on his face. He rapidly made his way over to General Hayes. "Sir, this just came in from intelligence," Whitman announced. "They received a flash message from the NSA. I'm waiting for confirmation from the Air Force as well. They said they had a recon drone headed over to investigate, so we'll hopefully have confirmation one way or the other shortly." Grimacing at what was probably bad news, General Hayes looked at the report, then motioned for Whitman to follow him to his private office. He needed to talk with him where no one else could hear them. Not only was the UN force not heeding the president's warning, they were mobilizing their forces. Once inside Hayes's office, Whitman asked, "Sir, do you think this is just them trying to make a show of things, or do you believe they're actually gearing up to attack us?" Whitman had just been promoted to general after serving in the 82nd Airborne as a brigade commander. He was being groomed to take over a division command himself in a couple of years. Hayes sighed. "Don, I think things are about to get real crazy real fast in a few days," he responded. Then he pulled his keys out of his pocket and walked over to the vault built into the wall of his office. He pushed the appropriate key in and turned it, unlocking the door. General Hayes pulled out a folder that read "Top Secret / No Foreign / Orcon" on it, and placed it on the desk between him and his deputy. "I wasn't supposed to show you this until December 31st. I just received it via courier 5 hours ago from the Pentagon. It's been signed and approved by the President." General Whitman looked at the folder. He hadn't seen a set of orders ever arrive at a military command he'd ever served in quite like this. After staring at it for a few moments without saying anything, he looked up at Hayes. "Have you read it?" General Hayes shook his head. "Not yet. I was told to read it and acknowledge it by COB today. I still have another 2 hours, but I figure I might as well look at it with you. I know the instructions said not to share it with anyone else until December 31st, operational security and all, but hell, I need some help deciphering all of this crap going on in our country." "You and me both," Whitman replied. "It's like a switch was turned on in September, and the country hasn't been the same since." Hayes sat down,
then broke the seal on the new set of orders and opened it up. Top secret /no foreign /Orcon. By order of the Secretary of Defense, the President of the United States has authorized Operation Fortress, the authorization of offensive military action to be taken against United Nations peacekeeping force and any other host nations providing material support against the United States of America. The President has authorized the Secretary of Defense to use any and all means necessary to defend the territorial integrity of the United States. By order of the Secretary of Defense, United States Northern Command, U.S. Northcom, will assume command of all CONUS military forces effective 31st December 2020. U.S. Northcom Commander General Raymond Moore, USAF, is being replaced with General Joseph Tibbets, USA, effective 31st December 2020. All division commanders are hereby ordered to make ready for combat operations. All forces, by no later than 15 January 2021. Operation Fortress will commence on or shortly after 15 January 2021 if peace talks fail. Division commanders are hereby ordered to prepare their forces and facilities to repel any potential attacks or incursions by either foreign or domestic forces, effective immediately. Authorization for the use of deadly force to defend your military assets has been authorized. Warning orders and additional appendices are attached for immediate implementation. General Hayes and his deputy spent the next 20 minutes going over the rest of the orders and the attached appendices as they contemplated how they'd go about implementing them. From everything they'd read, it looked as if a military confrontation was not only inevitable, but imminent. The talking heads on the various news outlets were certainly not on the same page as reality at the moment.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.